In this first lesson, we're going to be talking about useState. useState lets us control what's displayed on the page based on user interaction. To get started, let's use array destructuring, and let's make a variable called messages and another one called setMessages. That's because this useState function call returns an array, and we can name it whatever we want. This just helps us make our state variables more intuitive depending on what we're actually doing in our application. useState can take one optional parameter, and that's the default state. In this case, let's make it an empty array, and then let's add a couple messages. So this is going to represent a status list similar to Twitter. Now that we have that, let's actually render these out. So the way we do that is first, let's make a UL because we're going to render an unordered list. And then we will say messages.map. And then for every message, we want to return some JSX. In this case, we want to return some list items. And then we will also want to add a key prop here so that React doesn't throw a warning. The key here is generally a unique identifier from your backend so that if you remove items in the list or move them around, it knows how to most efficiently update the list. But now if we save that, we'll see useState is not defined. We just need to make sure that's imported. Now run that again, and we see our list of items. With that in place, we've done everything we can normally do with just props or a static array. Let's actually make this interactive and change based on some user input. Let's imagine we had a component called status. And in this component, whenever someone types something in, we want to call this prop on enter whenever they hit the enter key inside of it. And we want that prop to give a callback with the value that was passed in, and so we can do something with it. In this case, imagine a field, and on enter, it gives you the text string that the user had typed in, and then we would call setMessages, and we would pass in the value and all the previous messages. And I incorrectly wrote this. Value is just a string, and we want to spread the remaining array that was already there. You may find this a bit weird that I wrote a component before it existed, but I find that this can help you sometimes when you want to make the best component API possible for what you're trying to do. So now that we have this in place, we'll hit save, and we expect it to fail because status doesn't exist. So let's go into our folder here, and let's make a new file, and let's call it status. So I'll just use my autocomplete to make this component, and then inside of it, let's render an input field. Let's give it a type of text. And then let's just save that. Let's go back into our main app and let's make sure we import it. There we go. Now we have an input field at the top and nothing happens when we type in it, nothing happens when we hit enter. So let's make that actually work. Let's add another useState here and let's call it message and setMessage this time. This is for an individual message. And then let's say useState and then let's default it to an empty string. Now when we come into our input, we need to set the value equal to message. And then we'll also want to add an on change here so that it changes when we type. And the way we access these on change events is just like vanilla JavaScript. So you'll say setMessage, and then you'll say event.target to get the element, and then the value of that element, just like that. So now when we hit save, and we actually import the useState, and hit save again, when we type, it'll change and everything just like we expect. Now there's only one last piece. We need to pull in our onEnter prop. Let's pull in our onEnter, and then how do we actually do this? If you're new to JavaScript in general, this is also going to be new to you. We'll need to add an onKeyUp listener, and this event will give us a unique thing called keycode. And so we can say if the event keycode is 13, which is the enter key, then we want to call the onEnter prop. And you may be thinking that's all that we need to do, but I'll show you why. There's one last piece. So now let's type hello, and hey, look, it added to our list. But that one last piece I was talking about is whenever we hit enter, we'll want to clear our message in here. So let's set the message back to an empty string. Let's do that one more time. So now when we hit enter, we get the item added to the list and our input clears. Now this may seem like a lot considering it's our first lesson and our very first hook we use, so I want to go over it one more time. We started out by making a messages array, and we pulled out a setMessages function which lets us change the state whenever we want. We defaulted that state to an array with 2 items in it, and then we created a component called status which has one prop called onEnter. Whenever the user hits enter, it calls a callback. In this case, this is our callback with the value of that input field. We're able to then add it to the messages array like so and display them down below. Inside of our status, it's even simpler. It just has a state for message and set message. Every time the user changes a value in the field, the message is updated. Whenever the key code is 13, then we call on enter and we clear the message internally. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about useReducer. useReducer is a step up above useState, and it's useful when you need to track multiple different pieces of state and you want to do it in a cleaner way. Before we get started, make sure your root index.js is pointed to current/app, and make sure your current/app looks just like mine. To get started, we'll do something that you should be familiar to. We'll do array destructuring, and this time we'll use a variable called state and dispatch, and we will call useReducer. Now, useReducer has a required first argument, which is the actual reducer that we want to create. Reducer is just a fancy name for a function that takes two arguments, state and action. State will be the current state that you're currently in, and action would be the new action that someone is sending that is going to change the state. This is commonly used with switch statements, and so we'll follow that pattern here. We'll say switch on the action.type, and for right now, we'll just make one case. When there's a button click, we want to return a new state. We'll do that by returning the current state and then the thing we want to change. In this case, the count. So we will add 1 to whatever the current count is. And then we will add a default case just in case and return the state as is. You'll notice I forgot a colon here. And now everything's good. Next, we need to add a button that we can actually call this click method on. So I'll add an actual div here, I'll add a button, and then I'll add an onClick to it. In this onClick, we will call dispatch, which is how we actually send out a new action, and we'll give it a type of button click, exactly as we put up there in the case. And now we have a button that has nothing inside of it, which is not what we want. So I'll put something in here that says click me and close the button tag correctly. And now you'll notice that when I click, can't read count of undefined. So the reason this is happening is because I'm saying state.count, but state is not set. It should be an object, so we will actually pass this as the second argument to useReducer. I'll put count equal to 0 when the page first loads. Now pressing click me doesn't break the page, but we also don't see what the current count is. So now we can reference it by saying the current count is state.count. When we run that, every time we click, it's getting incremented. If you're brand new to React, you might think, wow, that is a lot of work just to have a little button counter. But the power of useReducer is when you're having multiple states that you need to track. So let's just add an input field here. And let's say it's input type text. Let's give it a value of state.username. And then let's also do an on change. And let's make a new action that we can send out from this same component. Let's say dispatch type set username. And we need to actually give it the value of the username. In this case, I need to grab the event object here from the onChange event. And I need to say, we can call it value. Now, when I actually close off that component, you'll notice that we have our input field here, type text, the value is state.username. Every time we type inside of the field, we will call set username with the value. If we do something right now, nothing really is going to happen, but we can fix that. Let's add a new case here, and let's call it set username because that is what we called it below. And then we'll say return the current state, just in case we have other state variables. In this case, maybe there's already a count. We want to keep that state around and only change the one thing. And the username will come from action.value. The reason it's called action.value is because we decided to call it that down here. This could really be anything we want. I could put username inside of here, and now I just need to make sure and update it here as well. Now below, let's just say your current username is state.username. Now when we click me, we have our count. When I type something, you'll see that the username is changing. You'll notice that familiar error that we had in the first lesson, and we can fix that very easily as well, just by adding username and making it equal to an empty quote when they first load the page. And you'll see once again, no errors, and both of our states are being tracked. So the benefits of using useReducer is so that you can keep all of your state logic in one spot. The idea being that your component can kind of be free from state logic. You just call this useReducer right here, and you can just dispatch actions. It keeps your components really clean, and they're just UI focused. There's no state manipulation that has to happen inside of them. In this episode, we're going to be talking about useContext. Context is very helpful when you need to change state between components that aren't directly children of each other. If you're not sure what that means, here's what it looks like. We're going to create a couple components here. We'll call one content, and we'll call another one sidebar. Now imagine I wanted to make the sidebar change the state of something inside of content. Usually you don't want to do this, but when you need to, that's what context is for. Imagine the sidebar has some sort of control to change the theme of our application. Maybe I want to switch from dark mode to light mode, and the sidebar has a control for that in the design. Well, context would be a great way to handle changing the state of your whole app from inside of this sidebar. Next up, let's actually create these files. Let's make a content.js, and let's just put a div in here that says, here's our main content. Next, let's create our sidebar component. And now in here, we're going to say, let's just say click here to change the theme. And now let's go back into the app.js and actually import these. And now when we reload this, it should load. Okay, so here's our main content. And then on the side, it says click here to change the theme. Let's add another nested component just to really show the power. So let's say we have something called theme control.js, and this one will be the one that actually changes the content. Now we'll go back inside of our sidebar, and in here we will just let's just put a header that says sidebar, even though it's not actually on the side, and then let's put theme control. And now we have them all laid out just like we need them for this context example. Sometimes it's a little hard to visualize, but the way this works is our app.js renders content and sidebar, and inside content is just some text. Inside of sidebar is also theme control. A much better way to visualize this is with the React dev tools. You can take a look in here, you'll see we have our app, and then we have content and sidebar next to each other, and theme controls inside of sidebar. Again, context will let us use something inside of theme control and change the state of something in content, which is completely outside of its tree. Now that our components are all laid out, we can start working on our context. Let's make a new file called appcontext.js. So the first thing we need to do is make sure we have React imported. And then we need to create our context. Let's call it appContext. And we'll make that equal to react.createContext. This function does take an argument. It could be the initial value of the context, but we won't worry about that because we'll be setting it ourselves later. Next up, I like to export two things. I like to export something called useAppContext. Generally, this is use and then whatever name of my context. It's a little wrapper around the useContext hook. This way, whenever I want to use this context, I can just import one thing, this one function, instead of having to import the useContext variable and the app context. This will make more sense in a minute when we use it. Lastly, I need to export a provider. This provider will give access to the context to anything that's underneath this component. So we will call this app provider, and we will say this is a component that takes in children, and then it will return app_context.provider, and it's a component, so I need to correctly do that. And then inside of it, we will render the children below. So this is almost working, but here's the magic part. The magic is we will also pull in a useState. Now that we have that in place, let's default it to an object. And then the way we actually set this into our context is this provider component takes a value prop. And inside of that, we will spread the current state, and we'll add a new function here. Let's call it setTheme. And this will take some sort of string, and it will call setState. And we're going to spread the current state in case there's other stuff in it later on, and we will set the theme into state. Just to recap, we created our context at the very top. We exported a hook so that we can use that context later on. And then we exported an app provider, which actually provides access to this context to any components that are underneath it. And then what we actually have inside of our context is a useState, which just spreads the current state, which at the time of rendering is just an empty object. And we also added a setTheme function to our context. Now all that's left is to use our provider and then use our context to actually change the theme. So first off, let's take this app provider and go to our main app.js. Let's put app provider right here, and we wrap it around these components. And if you're new to React, the components that are underneath a component are its children, and React passes that in as a prop so that you can return those and do something with them later. In our case, we are just rendering these underneath it. With that in place, let's go over to our theme control and hook it up. Let's pull out theme and setTheme from our context. Remember, we can access anything on the context that's inside of that value prop in our app context file. Since the state is spread and there's an object with setTheme, and we're going to add a theme key to it, we can pull that out just like this from our useContext hook. Now let's add an onClick. And inside of this onClick, we're just going to handle changing the theme. So we will call setTheme, and we're going to say if the theme is currently dark, then let's return light. Otherwise, let's return dark. This will just make it toggle. You'll notice if we click toggle the theme, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't appear to because we're not taking advantage of this actual theme key that we just created. So let's copy this and go into our content. Again, content is not a child of this component at all. It's next to it. And if we come down here, you'll see that content and sidebar are next to each other. Theme control is inside of sidebar, and it's not even a part of content. So now if we copy that in here, we can take advantage of the theme and pull it out of context. And again, the reason we can do this is because the context does wrap all of these components. You'll see app provider is a parent to all of these components. And now in here, we can just set some sort of style prop. Let's say the color, if the theme is dark, we'll make it black. Otherwise, we'll make it red just to make it easy to see. So now toggle the theme, and you'll notice it toggles it at the top. That was a lot of stuff, and it may seem a little confusing, especially being new to React. Context is more of a powerful tool for when you're building out really big applications and need to pass state in this way. It's a little bit hard to demo in a small example like this, but we will get into it more in our later videos. Before I end this one, I just want to recap everything that we did. First, we have our app provider around our entire application. This lets us access the context from anywhere in our app. Our sidebar wants to toggle a theme that needs to take effect inside of content. So inside of sidebar, we have a nested component called theme control, which can still access the context from anywhere, no matter how deep it is. Even if we had more components inside sidebar and theme control had a component inside that, you could always access context. Lastly, we come over to content and we use that context as well to change the theme. And all of the logic really happens in our main app context.js, where we created our app context. We created a little hook that we can export. And then we have our app provider, which just uses state and sets that into context. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about useEffect. UseEffect lets us do something based on something else changing. In the case of this example, we're going to be listening to a window listener for when dark mode changes on our computer. So if someone changes their mode from light to dark, our web page will live update. Another scenario might be if a variable changes, then we want to rerun an API request. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with useEffect, and this is just one example. Let's set up our app.js to be ready for this hook. Let's say is dark mode, and let's make it a boolean that's false. Now inside of this div, let's just say here's some content. And then let's add the correct styling here based on this variable. So we will just set the height to 500 and the width. And then we'll say if is dark mode, then we want the color to be white. If it's not in dark mode, we want the color to be black. And it would be the opposite for the background color. So if we're in dark mode, we want the background to be black because that's the majority of the area. Now with that, we'll see here that it's just rendering like normal, like we'd expect. If we set it to true, it's going to look like this. With that out of the way, let's just set it back to false, and let's get started on our hook. So let's create a new file, and let's call it useDarkMode. Let's start by defining a function called useDarkMode. Inside of this function is where all the magic is going to happen. Let's create a function that will be our listener that will handle taking the event. This event is going to give us a property called matches on it. For right now, we will just console log it. But if event.matches is true, that means we're in dark mode. Next up, let's add our useEffect. UseEffect takes a function, and inside of that function, you can do something. In our case, we're going to say window.matchMedia, and then we're going to say prefers color scheme. If you say window.matchMedia prefers color scheme dark, you can then add an event listener to that, and we'll say whenever it changes, we want to call our listener function. So we have that in place, but another important part of useEffect is when you're doing an event listener, you need to make sure you clean it up. If this component gets removed from the screen, React needs a way to clean up this event listener so it doesn't keep trying to call this function when the component no longer exists. So it's just a way to prevent memory leaks. And so we can return a function, and inside of this function, we can do our cleanup. We will do the same exact thing, but we will say remove event listener. So I will copy it and add remove event listener. Now that we have that in place, the last part we need is our dependency list. So for this useEffect, we want it to just run, and there's no dependency on it. We just want it to run anytime React needs it to. It takes care of doing that for us. Now if we take a look, let's actually try using this. So let's export it, and then let's import it into our main app here. And let's see what happens here. Okay, so our console has nothing yet. But if I go onto my other screen here, and I will change my computer from dark to light under the general settings on a Mac. I just switched it to light and it said false. And now I switched it to dark and it said true. If we go inside of our hook again, you'll see that makes perfect sense. Event.matches is true and it's logging out correctly. Now there's only two more things to do. We need to actually hook this into state, and we need to get whatever mode it's in when the page is first loaded. let's create a state here. Let's call it dark and set dark. And we're going to be using useState, which we learned about. You'll notice these hooks build on each other a lot. In our case right now, we're building a custom hook called useDarkMode, and it needs to use state, and it uses an effect to do all of its logic. Now, inside of here, instead of console logging, let's just set dark. If event.matches is true, set dark is true. It will correctly track it. And now at the end of our hook, outside of our useEffect, we can just return dark. Now, when we go inside of our app, useDarkMode should work correctly if I change my appearance. Let's go to light, so I'm in light. Let's click dark now, and it works. The only problem is I'm in dark mode, and if I reload the page, it doesn't work. What we need for that is just an initial check in our hook. Let's make a variable here called initially dark. And that will be if window.matchMedia, same stuff here, .matches. It's a very similar syntax. Now in our useState, we can have the initial value be initially dark. Now our hook completely works. This is a real hook. You could publish it to NPM if you wanted. I think this is actually very useful as well. So I'll go back into my settings on my computer. I know you can't see it, but I'll click light mode and it's swapped. And I'll go back to dark. And just to show it again, I'll go back to light and I'll refresh the page. You'll see that it fully works exactly as we would expect. Hopefully you found this tutorial much more realistic and things are starting to come together for how hooks work and how you can compose them.